Perfumed wigs crawling with lice. Toilets, optional. Welcome to Versailles, where the chandeliers sparkled but the stench could knock out a warhorse. Forget refined elegance behind the silk and powdered faces lurking habits so revolting, you'll wonder how France didn't collapse from infection alone. These royals redefined disgusting, and they did it with style. Let's peel back the velvet curtains and sniff the foul truth. Perfumed lice farms. Imagine strapping a dead raccoon to your head, then calling it chic. That's basically what powdered wigs were at the French royal court. These towering perfumed monstrosities weren't just fashion statements, they were ecosystems. A whole writhing metropolis of lice, fleas, and sometimes even rats could set up shop inside that tangle of horsehair and sweat. Bathing the scalp underneath? Rare. Combing? Practically treasonous. Instead, courtiers just dumped mountains of scented powder over their heads until they looked like frosted pastries gone rancid. Perfume wasn't for allure, it was camouflage, a chemical fog to cover the stench of skin rotting quietly below. Scratching became an aristocratic sport. Picture Versailles, glittering with chandeliers, while dozens of powdered nobles clawed at their heads like frantic apes in silk stockings. The wigs grew so filthy that servants often had to fumigate them, sometimes baking them in ovens just to kill what lived inside. But here's the punchline. The dirtier your wig, the richer you looked. It meant you could afford gallons of powder and servants to scratch you. In Versailles, lice weren't a shame, they were a status symbol. Nobility by infestation. And if you think that's revolting, wait until you see what they did with their toilets. Versailles as a giant toilet. If the wigs weren't enough, the palace itself smelled like a sewer with chandeliers. Versailles may have dazzled with gold leaf and endless mirrors, but underfoot it was basically one giant public restroom. Courtiers didn't just wait for chamber pots, they went wherever they pleased. Hallways, staircases, fireplaces, it was all fair game. Imagine stepping into a marble corridor, expecting elegance, and instead finding a steaming pile of royal business left by some duke in silk breeches. Servants lugged chamber pots through crowded rooms like waiters carrying wine, except these trays sloshed with human waste. And when they were full, out the window, straight into the immaculate gardens. Visitors described ducking as waves of filth rained down, splattering the very fountains meant to symbolize France's glory. Versailles became a slip-end slide of excrement. The irony is, this wasn't shocking back then, it was normal. Toilets were too bourgeois. The Sun King himself had a ceremonial chair with a hole in it, so his subjects could watch him rule while relieving himself. Talk about multitasking, and if you think the palace reeked now, wait until you hear how rarely they actually bathed. Baths were for peasants. By now you might think, surely they cleaned themselves after all that filth. Wrong. In Versailles, bathing was practically heresy. Doctors swore water was dangerous, that it opened the pores and invited disease to crawl in. So, the nobility proudly embraced dirt. The less you bathed, the more refined you appeared. Cleanliness was for peasants. Stink was for kings. Marie Antoinette, the fashion icon herself, was said to bathe only a handful of times a year. The rest of the time, she soaked in layers of silk and velvet, trapping sweat until her gowns smelled like swamp water simmering in perfume. Summers at court turned into a sauna of rot, dozens of courtiers crammed together, each marinating in their own juices under powdered wigs. Instead of soap, they relied on perfumes, powders, and endless changes of linen never washed properly, just aired out like rotten meat in a breeze. If you brushed against a noble in a crowded hall, you weren't just touching fabric. You were touching weeks of accumulated filth, sealed in by fashion, and as their skin festered beneath the silks, their mouths told an even worse story. Mouths of decay. If their bodies reeked, their mouths finished the job. The French court adored sugar-candied fruits, cakes dripping with honey, mountains of marzipan, and they devoured it daily. But here's the problem. Toothbrushes were rare, and toothpaste wasn't exactly trending, so their teeth rotted like apples left in the sun. Louis XIV himself had such advanced dental decay that nearly all his teeth fell out. Imagine the Sun King, ruler of Europe, slurping his royal feasts like a toothless toddler. Courtiers described his breath as so foul it could clear a room. And yet, people still lined up to kiss his hand, and sometimes his face. Intimacy became an act of survival. How long could you hold your breath before fainting? Dentistry wasn't mercy either. Early dental procedures involved yanking rotten teeth out with pliers. No anesthesia, just screams echoing through gilded halls. Afterwards, back to the sugar. Decay was inevitable. Halitosis was legendary. and yet somehow they still believed worse things could be swallowed in the name of medicine, which brings us to the most golden cure-all of them all, urine, piss as medicine. Yes, you heard right, royals drank their own urine, not out of desperation, but out of fashion. Court physicians swore it was a miracle cure, a golden elixir that could cleanse the body and balance the humours. So nobles dutifully filled crystal flasks with warm, steaming samples of themselves, sipping it like fine brandy. Imagine Versailles, with nobles swirling glasses of urine, sniffing for notes of asparagus. Some went further, bathing in it, rubbing it into their skin like perfume. Doctors prescribed it for headaches, gout, and even plague. Never mind that it was just concentrated waste, it was considered divinely recycled medicine. The irony? Drinking it probably made them sicker, but when you're surrounded by filth, what's a little more going to hurt? It became so normalized that some courtiers kept collections of rows of bottles, each dated like a grotesque wine cellar. And when one royal proudly sipped his vintage, the others followed, because nothing says aristocracy like drinking what your body just rejected. If that wasn't revolting enough, wait until you hear what they did with their handkerchiefs. The Handkerchief Crisis. Now picture this. Dozens of nobles, dressed in shimmering silks, each pulling out a handkerchief, not for elegance, but to blow great wet trumpets of snot. Hygiene etiquette at Versailles was less dab delicately and more unleash the plague. And the kicker? They didn't toss them away. Oh no, these embroidered squares of filth were tucked right back into pockets, festering for days or weeks, until they could practically stand upright on their own. Some handkerchiefs were passed down as heirlooms, carrying not just noble crests but noble diseases. At banquets, it wasn't uncommon to see courtiers whip them out mid-feast, honk loudly, and continue eating with the same hand. Bon appétit. Servants later collected these mucus-sodden rags, sometimes wringing them out before washing or worse, reusing them as rags for cleaning tables. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a petri dish embroidered in gold thread. And if you think that's disgusting, just wait until the royal obsession with lapdogs, because those little creatures left more than just companionship on the palace floors. Dog filth everywhere. Versailles wasn't just crawling with lice, it was smeared with dog droppings. Tiny lapdogs were the hottest accessories, tucked under arms and pampered like furry jewels. But here's the dirty secret. They weren't house-trained. The palace floors became dotted with little royal presents, and nobles simply stepped around them as though piles of steaming waste were part of the decor. Servants scurried after the dogs with rags, but standards were low. Sometimes the same cloth used to wipe feces off the floor ended up polishing tables or dishes. Picture it. A lavish banquet, silver platters gleaming, carrying food that had just been swabbed with a rag soaked in poodle leaves, and no one batted an eye. The dogs weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. They sat on velvet cushions, gnawed meat from gold plates, and left their marks wherever they pleased. The stench blended seamlessly with perfume, sweat, and rot, until Versailles smelled less like a palace and more like an overcrowded kennel. And if you think the dogs were bad, wait until you hear about the medical cures that turned noble bodies into bloody buffets. Leech therapy galore. When sickness swept the court, doctors didn't prescribe rest, they prescribed bloodletting. Enter the Leech, the slimy little physician's assistant of Versailles. Nobles were swarmed with them, slapped onto pale skin until they gorged themselves like drunk vampires. It wasn't unusual for a courtier to lose pints of blood in a single treatment, staggering away weaker than when they arrived. The fashion of the day turned anemia into a look. Fainting aristocrats were praised as delicate beauties, when in reality they were just being slowly bled into oblivion. Some nobles wore their leech scars proudly, like grotesque badges of refinement. Doctors even applied them to eyelids, gums, and yes, even genitals, promising balance of the humours. Balance in this case meaning near death. And the best part, the more sickly you looked, the more noble you seemed. Health was for peasants. Illness, pallor, and weakness were marks of sophistication. Versailles wasn't just bleeding money, it was bleeding people, one leech at a time. But if you think that's humiliating, wait until you see how public even their bathroom breaks become. Sharing the royal chamber pot privacy was a luxury Versailles didn't bother with. Even the most personal act, relieving yourself, was turned into public theatre. Louis XIV had his own ceremonial chamber pot, a velvet-upholstered throne with a hole in the middle. Every morning courtiers gathered to watch him conduct royal business, in every sense of the word. His bowel movements weren't shameful, they were political. Access to witness them meant access to power. But the king wasn't the only one. Nobles squatted in corners of the same rooms, using smaller chamber pots while carrying on casual conversations. The smell was overwhelming, yet it became background noise, like candle smoke or harpsichord music. Visitors wrote about the shock of walking into glittering salons, only to find piles of excrement hidden behind tapestries. Servants had the worst task emptying these communal pots, sloshing their contents through hallways already slick with filth. Versailles may have been the jewel of Europe, but it doubled as a latrine with chandeliers, and when the stench grew unbearable, they didn't wash. They drowned it all in rivers of perfume, which brings us to the final fragrant horror. Perfume instead of soap. By now, Versailles smelled less like a palace and more like a compost heap wearing diamonds. But instead of soap and water, the solution was perfume gallons of it. Nobles drenched themselves until they dripped like oversprayed mannequins at a small fragrance counter. Perfume wasn't about smelling nice. It was about chemical warfare, masking the rot of bodies, wigs, dogs, and toilets. Clothes were rarely washed. Why ruin expensive fabric with water? Instead, courtiers simply sprayed layer after layer of scent, sealing in sweat, vomit, spilled wine, and worse. A noble's coat could carry years of filth, a walking archive of dinners, dances, and accidents. Approach one too closely, and you weren't greeted by roses or lavender. You were hit with a nauseating cocktail of jasmine layered over decay. Ironically, Versailles became the birthplace of Europe's perfume obsession, not because they loved smelling good, but because they were too filthy to live without it. In the end, the Palace of Refinement was a reeking masquerade, dressed up in lace and drowning in musk. And when the revolution came, no amount of perfume could cover the stench of decay. So there you have it, the French royal court, the glittering cesspool of Europe. Beneath the silks and chandeliers, they scratched lice, waded through feces, guzzled urine, and drowned themselves in perfume thick enough to suffocate a horse. These were the people who defined refinement, while smelling worse than the peasants they sneered at. And in the end, all the perfume in France couldn't hide the rot. The guillotine didn't just end a monarchy, it put Versailles out of its misery. Because when your rulers stink worse than your livestock, revolution isn't just politics, it's hygiene.